afternoon. Really happy to be here sharing some of my work. I'm going to talk, so I'm hoping this is, I always tell my students don't start a talk with an apology, but I'm going to start this talk with an apology. I hope it doesn't feel disjointed, because I'm talking about 3 different studies, and I kind of, normally when I do that I would talk about them consecutively, but I'm going to kind of bounce it back and forth between them. So I hope that this is okay. If you get lost or confused, throw up a hand, we can make it a dialogue. Focusing on thinking about what we understand about how we can understand and design for equitable STEM learning environments. I've been thinking so much about how we as a field move from critique to building things. And so I tried to take a kind of a new slice on some work that I've talked about before, which is to say, how can this work inform what we would build, right? Rather than just saying, what are the multiple ways the current learning environments don't work, particularly for kids from marginalized groups, how do we think about what we would build? And, you know, in terms of building, people talk a lot about equity. We just finished at Spencer this world tour of 40 ed schools talking to faculty about what they care about, and equity was probably at the top of the list around what scholars in our field both worry about and want to work on. So it's kind of this universal goal, right, of scholars, of classroom teachers, of school systems, of school districts, and people agree that not only is equity kind of an ethical imperative, it's a pragmatic one, right, because we just cannot as a nation continue to be whole if we only develop a small subset of our population. It's probably even more true in STEM than generally. But while we know a lot about inequality and the multiple ways that we perpetuate it, we know less about what equity looks like in practice, right? We know less about how we disrupt current unequal systems and how we utilize both teaching at the classroom level and the organization of schools to do so. So that's what I'm going to kind of focus on today. As I said, I'm going to talk about 3 studies. The first is a study of equity pedagogy at a high school known in the research literature as Railside High. The Mathematics for Equity book came out of a collaboration with the teachers and former teachers from Railside High. So I'll talk about that work and kind of, I won't say so much about how they developed the pedagogy, but I'll talk about the kind of basics of it. What does it mean to enact an equity pedagogy in mathematics, and what did that look like in their classrooms, and how did they think about the work? Because one theme you'll see kind of throughout the talk is that it's both about what you do with people sitting in front of you in classrooms, but it's also about how you think about what you do. And how you think about it informs your relationship with the people in the learning space, and that's actually critically important. Okay, so I'll talk about equity pedagogy at Railside High. I'm going to talk about the African American Male Initiative in Oakland Unified. It was a district-wide initiative to better support African American male students throughout the district, and I'll talk about that, not content-focused, but dealing with identity in some really interesting and important ways. And then I'm going to talk about a study that was a collaboration with one of my former students, Sapir Vakil, who's now just started this fall as a faculty member at Northwestern, where where he redesigned the curriculum and pedagogy in a computer science course to focus it around equity as a part of his dissertation work and as an extension of some work that we were doing together. So I'll also talk about what that course redesign looked like and how it impacted students' abilities to think about themselves as computer science learners. That picture there is the cover of a new book that's coming out in December on the work in Oakland called We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys. I was so excited. You know how when those of you who've written books, you submit the proposal and you give it a title? And in my experience, invariably the publisher comes back and says, then they wait till the very end, and everything's bubbling along, and then they come back and say, you know, we don't really like your title so much. They didn't say that. They let me use We Dare Say Love, so I'm super excited about that. I got love in there, really important to me. Okay, so I'm going to toggle back and forth between those studies, but before I do, I want to do just a bit of kind of theoretical grounding in some of the main ideas that I think undergird this work for me. So I've been thinking a lot about how we think about inequality, like how we think about what it is and how that matters for where we can go from there. So some of the very early work on inequality really saw inequality and framed it as achievement gaps, right? As differences in outcomes for different populations of kids. And then we lamented nationally the degree of these differences in outcomes, and how, as always, poor people and black and brown kids at the bottom of this kind of racial hierarchy of achievement, as Danny Martin talks about. So we talked about inequality as achievement gaps, and then I think we moved as a field, by and large, to think about inequality as opportunity gaps. It's an important shift, right? So you go from saying, wow, some people just aren't doing well, to wow, some people don't have the opportunity to learn the same kinds of things as other groups do. And I think that is an important shift. Gloria Ladson-Billings even went so far as to think about it as an education debt, which is to say not only do current opportunity gaps exist by virtue of race and social class, but actually opportunity gaps have existed and compounded over historical time in really intentional ways, right? And so, but I've been thinking about this last way as a framing, and other folks have written and talked about this too. Inequality is opportunity hoarding. Because when we're talking about achievement gaps or opportunity gaps or even education debt, we're focused on what poor people and people of color don't have. But why don't they have it? Right? They don't have it because opportunity is actually being hoarded by higher SES and people of privilege, right? And so this idea that really, if we want to get to the root of inequality, we have to think about how whiteness and maleness get utilized to hoard opportunity, right? And then and because when you talk to like somebody like Amy Stewart Wells that has done all this work on changing inequality practices in schools, or people that have looked at detracking, like Jeannie Oakes. One of the things that has always struck me about that literature is that what you see is what happens when you go to detrack a school is the privileged parents go in hard to keep the current system. Why is that? Because it's a system of opportunity hoarding. So if we think about studying what privilege looks like, then you'll understand how to disrupt privilege. I don't actually do that in this talk, but I just wanted to say that because I think it's really interesting and important and it's striking me. And it also means, I think, that we think about what equity is differently. If inequality is about opportunity hoarding, or some people keeping all the opportunity for themselves, then equality or creating equity actually looks like redistributing opportunity, which is, again, just a different way to think about it that I've been playing around in my head. And it's about disrupting white privilege. So key to thinking about like this disrupting privilege for me, when you're thinking about the classroom level, is this relationship between learning and identity. And a lot of my work has been on this over many, many years. I won't say a whole lot about it except to say that for me, and this is important to kind of understand the work that I present that comes next, for me, learning and identity are deeply, deeply entwined, right? So as you come to be a learner in a space, you take on the identity as a learner and a doer in that space, which feeds your willingness to engage in what is often very difficult activity to continue learning, right? Particularly in STEM disciplines. And I've studied, as Susan mentioned, learning in school and out of school, and this research moment that sticks in my head with a track coach, because at a certain point I decided I was going to study places where learning was happening really effectively outside of schools in order to think about how was pedagogy organized, what were the relationships between teachers and learners. So this one track coach said, he does all of these things to build social relationships with his athletes. And the reason why he did that was because it mattered in a moment when he needed to push them to do something, and in track you're talking about physical learning, when he needed to push them beyond what they were comfortable with, if he had a relationship with them, they would go there, and if he did not, they wouldn't. And I think that's like a deep principle in terms of relationships between teachers and learners, that if you have a relationship, you can push people into a place, into the uncomfortable place that learning actually requires. So all of that to say that learning and identity as processes iterate with one another and either strengthen learning identities or weaken them, right? And you can see that process goes both of those directions. And so they're reciprocal processes that support one another. I think this is really important because as we think about that kind of opportunity hoarding and maintenance of white privilege in schools, one of the ways that maintains itself is by only leaving the space for certain types of identities, right? If we're only leaving the space for certain types of identities to go together with one another as well. I'll say more about that. I also think a lot about then if identity is really important to learning, how is it that learning spaces make identities available to people? Like sometimes when we think about identity, we think about it as a thing that sits within us that we take from place to place with us. But actually, my research would suggest, and other people, many other people, would suggest that actually identities are afforded in learning spaces, right? So, and meaning you don't get to choose to be just anything in a space. A space tells you who you are, right? So if you just take the layout of this room, I'm standing here at the podium positioned in a really different way than folks sitting in the rows. This learning space is telling us something about who we get to be, right? And so I think about the various kinds of resources that learning environments provide that people get to make identity out of, right? One of those kinds of resources is material resources. So the layout of the physical environment tells you something about who you are. So for instance, with the track example, you're wearing a jersey, you have on spikes, you're at the starting line, you are a track athlete, right? Similarly, classrooms, computers and pencils and paper and desks and all position us in certain ways with respect to material resources in a learning space. I'm going to talk probably less about material resources in the data I'm going to share today. Also, critically important to how you figure out who you are in a space are relational resources. Your relationships with other people in the space tell you who you are. So I remember a point when I was a brand new researcher and I would go to the American Educational Research Association meeting and I didn't know anybody. And I knew I was an outsider because I would see these people that clearly knew each other and they were these communities, and I saw these people who I would read their work, but I had no reason to talk to them and they had no reason to talk to me, so I'd go up and I would say, oh, I really like your work, and they'd say thank you, and then that would be it. Then clearly I was an outsider to that community, and then over the years I noticed more and more, oh, actually these are my friends, and actually I know the history of this work, and wow, this new study you've been working on, it's really interesting that came out of this old study. So your relationships with the people tell you something about who you are in a community. And then the third, and I'll talk a lot about this today, ideational resources. What are the ideas that guide the space? The ideas that guide the space tell you who you get to be, whether you're central in the space or peripheral, how you are positioned by others, the positions you get to take of yourself are deeply informed by the core ideas and values that are held in a learning space. So hopefully this will come alive a little more as I talk about the data. So again, I'm going to talk about these three studies. I wanted to just quickly give you a sense of the methods, the participants, and some basics about the study. So the equity pedagogy study was partly a review of other work folks had done on Railside. Railside has been heavily studied by Joe Bowler and Lonnie Horn and Vicki Hand, and a host of researchers in math ed have studied this space and written about it. So some of what I'll talk about exists in their work. And then, I had also done some work there. I came back to it a few years later. I was having coffee with one of the key department chairs there at Railside, and I think it was when I first came to Berkeley, and we were like, let's do something together. We haven't done a project together in a while. Like, what's going on at Railside? And he was like, things are rough, but let's document what we've done here. I'll get back to the why things are rough. But we went through a process with several of the lead teachers, and 4 of the lead teachers, where we met twice a month and provided a space for them to reflect on the work they had done, because while other people had written about it, they hadn't talked about it with each other in a way to think about how they would communicate it to others. There were all these shared practices and shared understandings that needed to kind of be crystallized, and so we went through a process together of doing that, and the book project came out of that. So what I'm going to talk about today is what we wrote about in the book. So there's that stuff there. The African American Male Initiative study was primarily an observational study where we were brought in, myself and my team of graduate students, to help them think about what was happening pedagogically in these classrooms of all Black, all male students with Black male teachers. Just what types of interactions and teaching and learning happen in these spaces. So we observed for 3 years several of these classrooms and interviewed about 50 students and instructors about their experiences there. And then the computer science redesign study came out of, as I mentioned, another study where we were looking at kind of high quality teaching and learning for Black students in Oakland There was one school that had some really interesting things happening around math and science academies. Out of looking at those academies, Sapir decided that taking a social design experiment perspective would be really fruitful in providing a computer science learning experience that had equity at the core. So I'm going to say more about that as we go on, but I just wanted to give you the kind of big picture of the studies. Now I want to say a little bit more about each of the contexts. This is where this bouncing back and forth, I really hope that it's going to be okay. So I want to say a bit about each of the contexts, and then I'm going to go into kind of what I see as common across them and talk about each of those commonalities. So Railside High School is a large, comprehensive, urban high school in Northern California, dubbed Railside in the research literature because it's just on the other side of the tracks. And a student population that was quite diverse, as you see there, and had a mathematics department that had been working by the time I studied them in the mid-2000s, they had been working for probably 20 years in creating this equity pedagogy together. That involved detracking their mathematics department, so all freshmen came in and took a detracked algebra together, having a block schedule where students took basically spent twice as much time in the math class so that you could take the courses over a semester, not over a year, which gave people a chance, excuse me, to catch up if they were falling behind. They had enacted a multi-ability curriculum based on some of the heterogeneous classrooms work of Rachel Lotan and Elizabeth Cohen. And they had achieved by this time a really strong record of success. Again, they had been studied in lots of places. This comes from Jo Bohler's study, a comparative study where she compared the outcomes at Railside with other schools. You'll see students scored better on the standardized tests, even though that wasn't their goal. They had more seniors who were taking calculus and pre-calculus, more students who reported liking math, more students interested in math-related careers. And probably the most important thing on that slide is at the very bottom, the elimination of gender and race-based gaps by senior year. So while students came in with some gender and race gaps, by the time they left Railside, those gaps no longer existed. So by all accounts, really successful enactment of pedagogy. And I'll say more about what that looked like. So AMA, district-sponsored program for African-American males, came out of the assessments of a new, at the time, Superintendent Tony Smith was really committed to equity work. And when he came on as superintendent, he had several kind of key areas of focus. This was one because when he looked at the data, he found that it was African-American male students who were being the least well served by the district. And the philosophy was this philosophy of utilizing targeted universalism, the idea that while you want all kids to get to the same outcome, how they get there isn't necessarily always the same path. Students need different resources to get to the same universal outcome. And so decided that if you could raise the achievement levels and better support the black male students in the district, that rising tide would lift all boats, right? So one of the main programmatic initiatives of the African American Male Initiative was to institute manhood development program classes with cohorts of students between 7th and 10th grade during the normal course of the school day, but with instructors who were black males. Interesting kind of side note, when they started, they thought, well, we'll just use the black males that are already teaching in the schools, and found that there were so few that they could not staff the courses. So they developed an entirely different model, which actually I think proved to be really integral to the approach that as it evolved, which was to recruit instructors who were in community-based organizations and settings, and then train them, and then have them in the classrooms teaching these classes. So the classes are held for one period each day, occasionally after school, led by black male instructors. They have a curriculum that covers kind of identity work, socio-emotional work, and does a lot of stuff around African American history. And then the third study, the context is what we're calling here Bay Prep High School, is a high school in Oakland that had, probably still has, one of the strongest academic profiles within the district. It was the school that the district identified as doing, having the best outcomes with Black students. And they were organized in this really interesting way where they had developed this multitude of academic pathways and academies. So there was like the broad school, but underneath that broad school there were all of these specific learning academies, including 2 that were focused on math and science. And the idea was kind of this magnet type of appeal where they thought if you put strong, small academic pathways and embedded them within this school, you would re-attract families that had left the district and newly gentrifying families that would be drawn to the school. It pretty much worked. Had some other side effects, which we'll see, which were that Black and Latinx students were largely excluded from the benefits of these academies. Let me show you a little bit about what that looks like. This shows just 2 of the academies, the Technology Academy and the Mathematical Sciences Academy. The Mathematical Sciences Academy was one of the original kind of math science spaces in the school that was developed in order to give students an opportunity to engage in really rigorously with math and science content. The Technology Academy developed later by a teacher who came to teach in the Mathematical Sciences Academy and realized, wow, these are all white and Asian students in this really diverse high school. This doesn't seem right. Let's start an academy that will really serve a broader portion of the student population. So you'll see there really stark racial differences in the proportion of students in these different spaces. I don't need to say too much more about that. And also the Technology Academy, oddly enough, is quite male-dominated there, which comes up in the data. And so our entry into this space was, well, first of all, we were sent to study it because we were studying schools that were doing very well. And so to find that there were these, that overall the school was doing well, but there were these stark differences within was striking and left us in a little bit of an awkward position. But we ended up engaging with the school, with groups of parents and students to actually help unpack why this stratification within the small schools was occurring and to help them think about strategies to disrupt this. So it turned out to be a really fruitful thing. One of the pieces of that is this redesign. This is just a student kind of giving commentary on these 2 academies. This is an African-American female student. When she's asked about the Mathematical Sciences Academy, she says quite succinctly, as teenage girls are wont to do, the vibe in the class is a no. and this is a part of a phenomenon that we documented where when we talked to administrators and said, well, clearly there are these racial differences in these academies. Why do these exist? Why are Black and Latino students not being represented in the most rigorous spaces in the school? What they said is, well, they're not qualified. This is a pipeline issue. The middle schools aren't sending us the kids who have qualifications to be in these classes. And then we talked to students and families who had a very different story. What students and families said is, well, I got in, but I would never send my child to such a racially homogenous space where they're going to have to be explaining themselves all day long, every day. And students were kind of on that, and the vibe is a no. Like, I don't want to subject myself to that space of whiteness. Right? This is what she says about the Technology Academy. I didn't know, it's a little more nuanced. I didn't know of people doing something that actually I would want to be doing. Not many girls, let alone Black girls. It's known to be Asian boys, but also Black boys. When I would walk into the class, I didn't want to be in there. So this, I think, again, for me, speaks to how important it is that the space of the classroom be a place kids can imagine themselves being and being whole and happy. And that's actually not, I think we sometimes think about that as extra to learning. That like, yeah, sure, kids might want to be there, but really they're about learning and they should. But no, actually it's essential that the space be a space that people can imagine themselves actually sitting and learning. So that gives you a sense of kind of the student perspective on these 2 academies. I'll say one more thing about the design, and then I'm going to jump into the kind of higher order points across the spaces. So Sapir decided that he was going to be a change agent in this space and work with the academy leader in the Technology Academy to redesign a computer science course where students could see themselves and could see themselves really engaging, and where they didn't have to feel a split between kind of their socio-political racial identities and their identities as computer science learners. So he engaged in a social design experiment, redesigned this 10-week course where the goal of the course for students were to create projects that made a difference along some equity dimension in society. So this is a picture of a project that two girls created, Lupe and Candace, where it's a game that is where there's the default avatar is this cute little black girl with fluffy hair. And the task is to both navigate the space, which they identified as STEM space, but also to jump over the white male characters that said condescending things to them, like, that's really good for a girl, right? So this was the game that these girls designed. I'll say a little more about that as we go on. So now you have the context set across all three of these studies. And so now I'm going to ask the question, so what was it about these three spaces, the African American Male Initiative Managed Development courses, this redesigned computer science course, and the equity pedagogy at Railside, what was it about those spaces that made them equitable? So I'm going to argue four things. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the first, a little time on those middle two, and some time on the last. So I'm arguing that there were four dimensions of these spaces that made them equitable. One, they provided a range of identity resources for learners and provided opportunities for learners to connect their socio-political identities with the learning space. So this connection between who you are and this STEM learning space, really, really critical. I'll probably spend the bulk of my time on that. Second, their pedagogy center on love. I'm intentionally using the word love. It makes some people uncomfortable. But I do think, particularly in AAMA, and to a lesser extent, but certainly present in the other spaces, this idea that if you're going to teach someone, you have to really love them. You have to really want the best for them. You have to really see yourself as aligned with them. Right? There was this one study that I did many years ago of a Muslim school in Oakland, and there was this kid in the school who was horrible. Like, he was by all measures horrible. Like, he was a bully. He wouldn't do what the teacher said. He would like step on people's backpacks walking out of the door. He was horrible, and he had been horrible for years. But what struck me was how the teachers dealt with him, because nobody dealt with him like he was horrible, right? And when I went, so I said, oh, I want to learn, like, how are they thinking about this kid? And I interviewed all the teachers he had ever had in the school, and they uniformly said the set of the same things. That one, they said, oh, he reminds me of myself when I was a kid, or he reminds me of my oldest son who was having some challenges. And so they did this thing where they made this kid them, or close to them, right? They didn't other him. They made him like them. And the second thing they did was to separate how he showed up behaviorally from his intellectual ability and from how they showed up with him relationally. So it didn't matter that he was behaving the way he was. They still had him over their houses to play with their kids, or they, on holiday, so there were all of these ways they brought him in, even though he was, so that's what I mean by love, right? That's, for me, the quintessential example of what it means to love the people you teach, that you assume their highest good, right? These spaces all uniformly held really high standards for learners, right? Which I think is super important, because when you say love, that sometimes means people think you mean this softening of the content. No, it actually means raising the bar on the content. It means saying, no, you can do this. Like, this is going to be really intellectually challenging, and you are really smart, and you can do this. So they hold high standards for learners, and they attend to the alignment. So I haven't quite fully worked out this last one. I'm going to say they attend to, and then I'm going to show you all the misalignments, so just bear with me on that. I'll figure out a better way to talk about this. They attend to the alignment between school, district, and classroom structure. And what I'm trying to say is there's something really interesting and important about the way learning settings are set within school settings, are set within school districts, are set within certain kind of socio-political times. And that alignment or misalignment between what's happening in a classroom and what's happening at these other levels is really important for what can be accomplished. Okay, so now I'm going into, now I'm going to talk about the first thing for a while, briefly about the second two things, and about that fourth thing. Okay. So these settings all provided a range of identity resources and allowed students to connect learning with identity. And I'll first talk about what this looked like at AAMA. So as I mentioned, the manhood development courses at AAMA were kind of all about identity. They were all about helping Black male students navigate what it means to be Black and male in society and in schools. So they had several priorities. They helped students develop a critical perspective on racial identity. They watched, for instance, commercials and analyzed how race and gender were being positioned in the popular media. They talked about what it meant to resist those stereotypical portrayals. So first to kind of name what it means, what it looks like to be stereotyped. And mind you, all of the students came in with stories about people crossing the street and clutching their purses, teachers assuming they were the one that was a troublemaker, being in an honors class and having the teacher look the first day and say, oh, are you sure you're in the right class? Like all of these ways in which the way that they show up physically mattered to how they were treated. So this work of resisting those stereotypes and thinking about oneself differently in expanded ways was really critically important. And they spent lots of time debunking stereotypes, having explicit discussions of what it means to be Black and male. And the instructors spent a lot of time role modeling new ways of being. And I argue in some writing about this that there were 4 kinds of stereotypes that they worked to debunk. 1, that Black males are hard and unemotional. 2, that Black males are anti-school. 3, that Black males don't prioritize the domestic sphere in terms of being fathers or husbands or friends. And 4, that Black males are criminals. So they spend a lot of time on all of those things. I can give you an example. There's one exercise in a class where the students are instructed to read the statement written on the board, and they all recite, "Society wants me to fail," right? And then the students are asked their opinion about this. Some agree, some disagree. Some say, well, that's not true because we have Obama in the White House, whatever, clearly. And so there's discussions about things overtly. And and then later in that same exercise, 2 students are asked to come up to the board and they're to complete these sentences. A lot of people think about me. They complete the sentence. If they really knew me, they would know, right? So this way of disentangling who you are as an authentic, full, whole, complex human being from this stereotype that people kind of hold you as. An example of this kind of role modeling new ways of being, one of the research assistants who's now on faculty at Wisconsin, Maxine McKinney-DeRoyston, she had so many babies while she was in grad school with me. So one of the babies was like tiny in one of those little front pouches, and she walked into the classroom to observe, and the instructor walked around, "Can I hold the baby?" And the kids in the class were like, well, why are you? Like, that's a very female thing of you to do, one whole thing. So this role modeling of what it looks like to actually be a full, nurturing human being was really important. They also did a bunch of stuff around historical role models, so going back over key figures in African American history. So anyway, big point, all of these ideational resources that expand what it means to be Black and male in this classroom and creates the space for one to be nurturing, for one to be intellectual, for one to care about school, all of these things that society says you can't be. And a range, you probably heard some of them already, of relational resources being made available to students in AAMA. One, there was a lot of emphasis on building a caring community, on supporting really rich and nurturing peer-to-peer relationships and teacher-student relationships. It's kind of purposeful rehaling of students, and we've written about all of this. Where, there's one instructor who's really amazing at that, who, a kid would be showing up argumentative in a class and the teacher would say, you should be a lawyer. You have a really good critical mind. So taking something that could be seen as a negative and spinning it as something that's actually an asset. And in doing so, helping project a future version of self that is really positive and productive. Another really important component of the space was this reframing what counted as a disciplinary moment And what was so, I think, important and interesting about this is that when we talked to Black male students outside of the AMA space, they talked a lot about the ways that they were disciplined by schools, by teachers, and at the classroom level and at the school level, the ways that they were called out for things that everyone was doing, suspended unnecessarily, assumed to be operating with the worst intention. So a lot of what happened in the AMA space was taking things that could have been a reason for a kid to be in trouble and making it not that. My favorite example of this is the first day of class. There's an instructor who's like fresh out of college. He just graduated from Howard, and is standing in front of the class trying to get the kids' attention, and he's giving the spiel. This class is about leadership, and this is what you're going to learn here, and you're going to do this thing. And a kid in the back starts like drumming on the desk. And so this is a challenge, like clearly. And the first year of the program, by the way, they made the mistake of inviting in all the kids who had disciplinary issues. Later they decided that varying it made a lot more sense. But this year, it was a certain group that they were working with. And the kid starts beating on the desk. And the instructor looks up and says, "Keep that beat going." And he starts talking to the beat that the kid is keeping. So you're taking this moment where the kid is offering it as a challenge. What are you going to do if I do this? And incorporating it into what we do rather than making it the other, right? So lots of ways that relationships between people became really central. There's also some really poignant moments of the instructors sharing their own pain and struggle and heartache with kids, so that the relationship between them is really sincere. And probably one of my favorite examples is a kid walking into one of these classes at the end of the school day with this hoodie on, and the instructor saying, "You can take that off, you're safe here," which is both this feedback that the hoodie's not appropriate, but also saying, "And I know why you need it, right? You need it to be safe, but you are safe here without it." So lots of ways these relational resources made these classrooms a place where kids didn't have to see a difference between themselves as people and themselves as learners. Okay, Railside. So at Railside, and again, I hope you're seeing some of the threads that pull through. At Railside, as I said, one of the projects that the teachers and I took on was to take what they had been doing and with them figure out what they were doing and why. So it was this great, like you take these master teachers and say, okay, what's the philosophy underneath it that you're just operating with that we want to kind of make explicit? So this is what they came up with one of the things they came up with in order to make their philosophy of learning explicit. I argue that these are the ideational resources that undergirded the classrooms at Railside. One, they believe that all teachers and students are learners all the time, right? Which is to say, the teacher is not the expert while the students are the learners. We are all learners. We all have growing to do, and we're all learners all the time. Second, this philosophy that what we do is work from strength and make space for vulnerability, which is to say, and they used to say this, in your class, you need to, so the kids that show up consistently smart, that see themselves as the smart kids in math, you need to find something those kids are not smart at. The kids that consistently show up as kids who don't see themselves as smart in math, you need to find something those kids are smart at. In other words, working from strength, and again, making space for vulnerability, making the space for people to be able to say, I don't know. So finding the spaces where the smart kids don't know is a part of this making space for vulnerability, and making the point that we are all vulnerable as learners sometimes. This kind of goes hand in hand with the third thing there, which is redefining what counts as smart. So, and redefining what it means to do math in school. So moving from a notion that what it means to be smart is to do it quickly and always have the right answers, to what it means to be smart is to actually deeply engage the questions, to pose questions of one another, to think about problems in new ways. Whether or not you come out with the right answer in the end, what it means to be smart is the way you engage, which means that everybody has the capacity to be smart. So these, I think, are the kind of basic ideational resources that undergirded the teaching at Railside. And then I want to say something about like what they actually did, because there was, and I was trying to figure out, is this ideational, is this relational, is this material? And I decided that this set of like what they did is all of it kind of mixed together, right? There's several important elements of how they set up the program of teaching and several important aspects of the teaching practice itself that led to the creation of these equity spaces. So in terms of elements of the program, the first and foremost that they identify is a shared collective commitment to equity. And again, I think you see that throughout all of the examples. That this commitment to saying, if we are teaching well, but we are only teaching some students well, we are not teaching well. That as a fundamental commitment, which leads to some of the other structural things, like the block scheduling, which afforded deeper dives into more conceptual mathematical topics. The focus on complex instruction and group work as a way of disrupting traditional lines of who gets to be smart, right? So where you have students doing lots of work in groups, but working on tasks that are intellectually challenging, that are mathematically rigorous. And then there's a lot been written. Judith Warren Little has written a lot about the teacher professional community at Railside, which is to say that not only were they working on developing this pedagogy together, they were working on problem solving the problems of practice that arose in their teaching. So they met with great regularity and with great depth, where they could say to each other, you know, I had this situation, this kid was in my class, he did this, I did this, they said that, and it went really badly. What happened? And they would deconstruct it and kind of analyze it together. They also had many practices around maintaining this teacher professional community, including observing in one another's classes regularly, onboarding new teachers so that their whole first year, they didn't teach in their own class. They spent their time co-teaching with the other instructors. So ways of maintaining these standards of this is what we do and this is how we do it. And then there were aspects of the teaching practice, what they actually did when students were sitting in front of them in class. The first being, and they really emphasized this, choosing group-worthy tasks. So the kinds of problems they had students working on together had to be tasks that one would best work on in a group, so tasks that you couldn't actually do on your own, tasks that were intellectually engaging, tasks that you could come into from a number of mathematical angles using a number of mathematical representations. And so choosing the task was of critical importance. And then presenting that task and allowing multiple mathematical representations, focusing on the big ideas and the concepts, and pushing students not just to say what the answer was, but to justify their work. And they argued that student presentations at the front of the room was really, really critical to their approach. And I think, again, if you look across these elements, you can see some of them really connect to some of the ideational pieces around the commitment to equity or the block scheduling. I mean, the block scheduling is also kind of this material resource. And some of them are focused on the relational, right? The student presentations, developing these relationships between learners that we are all kind of learners and novices sometimes. Say a little more about the relational resources at Railside. I talked some already about the teacher professional community, but those relationships teachers had with one another allowed them to show up differently with the students, right? Because at some level, this kind of teaching is really, really hard. And so them having spaces where they can say, you know, this is really hard and I think I'm failing at it, was really central to them being able to maintain it. Building caring and trusting classroom relationships. There was one a great example of this is in, well, let me go on. I'll come back to that. Assigning competence to students, so they have this thing about catching kids being smart and pointing it out publicly is a really important element of the practice. And then, you know, this use of humor and teasing. So it kind of goes back to, I think, that building connections through human processes, joking, laughing, making the classroom a space where one could have fun. So the thing I was going to say about building caring and trusting relationships kind of built on some of these other things. There was a student in one of the classes one year who had some really major kind of traumatic things happen personally. And this year the teachers were also doing this like demonstration lesson at this major math conference that happened in the Bay Area, where Bob Moses was there and like all these famous math education people were there, and they were up on the stage doing this demonstration lesson, and kid comes in late to the demonstration lesson. And you know, the teacher, he comes in, the teacher makes a joke about it, everybody laughs. And then after the students leave and the audience is debriefing, with the teachers. And Bob Moses makes a big deal about this kid. You know, some of you know Bob. He's very intense. He makes a big deal about this kid coming in late. This was a black male. Why would you allow this kid to come in late? This is not okay. You're lowering the standard for him. This is not okay. And the teacher says, well, you know, he comes in late to class every day because he walks his girlfriend to class first because he lost his mom this year. And his girlfriend, this almost makes me cry. His girlfriend was a really deep sense of source of support for him. And we just made the decision that this was going to be okay because this is what he needed. So for me, it speaks to the kind of depth of the caring, trusting relationships where the rules exist only to support kids in being able to be full human beings in the space. And so this sense of safety I'm arguing, allowed the emotional risk that learning requires. Learning requires emotional risk because it requires you to admit that you do not know and to be vulnerable. And unless you have the space for that vulnerability to happen, really good teaching and learning can't happen. So I think I'm going to, let's say just a bit about this. So back to this, so this is the computer science classroom. I think I just want to say with respect to the game that for the one of the student designers of this game, Lupe was a student who had a really strong activist and socio-political identity, but was really struggling with whether or not computer science was something she wanted to pursue. She was really good at it. She was clearly really, really smart and engaged, but she struggled with whether these were spaces that were worth her time and energy and whether they were spaces where she could be all of who she was. So there were other students who kind of came through this class and went from like not thinking about computer science in political ways to thinking about it more socio-politically. Lupe was a student who came in with that, and what she came out of this 10-week course with was a sense that she could utilize computer science to do the things in the world that she cared most about. I think that's the quickest. And I'll just say a quote from Lupe. She says, "The tech world has so many guys, but there really aren't a lot of girls. And when there are, they're in a male-dominated environment that makes them self-conscious about their abilities, purpose, and a lot of other things. We know this because this is how we feel." One time we were doing a lab where we were to take apart this computer, and this boy came and super patronizingly asked us if we needed help. He said we looked like we needed help because we were going a little slower than everyone else. That would be a huge reason for girls not wanting to be in STEM. And I think for girls of color, it's because there's no representation. You rarely see anyone that looks like you that's painted in a good light in the media if you're a girl of color. So you probably won't see one in STEM. So you can see this thing that she's wrestling with is this a space where I can do work that's important to me? And this game that she designs is this really important artifact where she brings together her awareness of what racialization and genderizing looks like in spaces and creates a game where you get points by jumping over the patronizing white male and by building solidarity with the other women of color in the game. A little bit more from Lupe. Post the course, she says, "I'm at an age where the question, what do you want to be, is becoming more relevant. I've always been scared that someday I'm going to sell out and do something that I hate. I feel like I even think of computer science like that, like being a part of a huge, unfeeling, oppressive corporation that makes you money, sure, but never does something good." And she says, and so post the project. I think that's another thing this project opened up for me. I never actually thought of computer science doing something like this. Well, I had, but it was so vague. It was like always you could create anything. It could change the world, which makes absolutely no sense because, like, how do you do that? How does it work? But now I totally know the process of how to locate a problem and narrow it down to something workable. So you can see the space that gets opened up in this 10-week unit is a space where she can bring together who she is with this content of computer science. So just I'm going to say a tiny bit about centering the pedagogy on love. Where this shows up kind of the most centrally is in the AMA space. And these are both quotes from instructors, two different instructors. One of them says, "I do this," so the question was, you know, why are you teaching this course? "I do this because I can. I do this for my people. I do it for those that did it for me. I do this to create men. I do it because we don't see enough black educators. I do this because I care about young black folks. I do this for every reason America doesn't want me to," right? And there he's pointing to this kind of social mission in the work The second is a different instructor who says, there was one brother, for example, that was having a tough time. I said, he needs some extra love, so let's give him a group hug. Of course he ran, and we all hugged. But afterwards, he was lit up. Like you could just see he was like, he makes this huge smile. It just made his day. So why do I go back to love? Because love works. And this kind of love at the center, and again, I think you see it in each of those contexts operating. Love in that computer science course looks like a place where students can bring who they are to the table and have conversations about important social issues. Love at Railside looks like really high standards, but kindness in how the pedagogy is enacted. I think I've talked about the high standards enough. And so I want to say a little bit before I end on this misalignment between classroom schools and districts. Because in each of these settings, there was alignment and misalignment. And sometimes the misalignment was consequential, right? So in AMA, as I mentioned, this course started as a part of a district-sponsored initiative that a really strong superintendent enacted. And so at one level, you could say this had support from the highest level of the district. But then that superintendent left after, I want to say, 2 years. And since then, they have had 5 superintendent changes between interims and permanents. We could go down a whole road on that, but we won't. And changing reporting lines. So initially, the program director reported directly to the superintendent. Then he was on the cabinet, but reported elsewhere. He says, this quote from him, I didn't put it in there, but he says, I've reported to the academic side. I've reported to the social side. I've reported to the community. Like, he's got this whole list of places in the district he reported. And there were all of these points over the years since this program started in 2010. All of these points of possible peril and near misses. An interim superintendent who was going to close down the program, but then all of a sudden this representative from the Obama White House showed up, like, we've heard great things about what you're doing, and then that stopped the shutting down of the program for that moment. Initially, the office started with just this guy. Like, he had no staff, no resources. He was an employee of the district, and he says he goes to a cabinet meeting to kind of introduce the program, and everybody's waiting for him to introduce the staff, and it's just him. And so this piece of having to build the whole structure from the ground up, including raising money. So he's got now lots of foundation support to pay the instructors and do all these things. So there's both this alignment in intention, but this misalignment in structure and resources. Similarly, different at Railside. Part of the reason, the impetus for the book project was the teacher, 2 of the key teachers in a particular year really wrestling whether or not they could continue to do this work at Railside, right? And in the end deciding not to. So the Railside that we all studied and knew doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, one of the former teachers was presenting at a conference about the work, and this is a few years ago, and there was someone in the audience who said, I want to go there, I want to see this place. And it turned out she was student teaching in that place, right? It just no longer was recognizable as Railside. And so the misalignment came with the accountability movement, and for a long time they had a principal in place who buffered them from the requirements of the district, and then a new principal came, a new superintendent came, and this superintendent was all about the test scores and textbooks. Like, if you were not using the textbook, this was not okay, and he would do, and his staff would do pop-up visits to the classrooms to make sure that they were using textbooks. So the teachers had this whole clandestine thing going where if somebody walked in from the district, they'd pull out the textbook. But these were people who had written a textbook, right? So the whole logic of it was totally turned on its head. But they, at a certain point, they introduced tracking at the district administrative level. They eliminated the block schedule, laid off a couple teachers, increased class size, and created choice enrollment across the district, which meant the student population changed, and they just felt like they could no longer do this work. And it was, there were tears. It was heart-wrenching. We interviewed all the teachers that year, and there were tears in many interviews just about how committed they were to the work, but how unable they were to continue to do it given the changes in support. And they didn't want to abandon the kids, but they couldn't sustain what they were doing. And in the end, as I mentioned, the whole thing kind of fell apart. And not only did it fall apart, it fell apart in ways that that taxed the teachers, right? Personally, emotionally, in terms of their sense of efficacy as professionals, So it's one thing to say this no longer exists and this instruction is no longer happening, but I think it's a whole other thing to acknowledge the damage that did to people who were had been seen as real experts. Okay, talk a little bit about the broader context of the computer science work in Oakland, which is just kind of a funny, interesting story. So there was a district-wide initiative to boost computer science in Oakland. Intel came in and gave $5 million. Jesse Jackson came and gave a talk. And in the talk he says, Bay Prep is going to be a resource for Silicon Valley. We will stop the killing. We will stop the violence. We can. We will. We must. The goal is Intel. The goal is Google. The goal is Facebook. And the students are hearing this, and they're like, this is weird. Because these are the same students we just talked about, right? Politically engaged, kind of really savvy. So these are just some quotes from kind of students' reactions to this positioning of them. They were like, I didn't like part of the speech. He said we are resources. We're not minerals, like we're human beings. I mean, and also some, like, I mean, it's pretty awesome. We're getting over $1 million. But what about Castlemont, which is a different school in the district, much lower resource, nothing. That's really messed up. Why should we get all the money? So the students are kind of seeing the cracks in this discourse, this broader discourse about computer science that creates this misalignment for them. So to conclude, equity in learning settings is possible, rests on a set of key principles and kind of processes, but it requires innovation and a willingness to do things another way, right? The AMA program, when they first decided they were going to pull teachers from the community, the district was like, no, you won't. You cannot have uncredentialed people in these classrooms. And they figured out how to enroll them in an extension course that was like, I can't remember what it's called, but like a vocational kind of credentialing program that, and they've, I think, shepherded 5 or 6 folks through that entire program that now have this vocational credential. But it requires systems to open up the possibility, right? Equity work is often offset by these institutional structures and broader discourses. That, I think, is really key. It's key because we have to work on shifting those things in addition to what happens at the classroom level. It's also important because it's again this personal tax that folks who are doing this work in learning settings have to carry of mediating these broader systems that aren't set up to do this work. And then finally, it requires attention to creating intentionally humanizing spaces. I feel like the past few years I've been talking a lot about this notion of humanizing. What does it mean to teach and learn in ways that acknowledges and allows and supports the kind of full humanity of the students? Because if you think about what racial and gendered stereotyping and oppression does, it limits humanity to just a few, right? And so what does it mean to expand the opportunities to be fully human and to do that super intentionally? So I'm going to end there. Thank you.